Okay, welcome to this talk. Now, Antoinette is doing a bit of an academic research project on the timeline of this pandemic. So basically, I'm just going to hand over to Antoinette, and it's your interview, Antoinette. Away you go.
All right, so
Whatever you would like to ask is fine.
very well. So I'm a student at Purdue University Northwest. I'm working towards earning a bachelor's degree in biological sciences with a concentration in biotechnology, and I'm looking forward to pursuing a PhD in gene therapy and stem cell research. So
Wow, I'm
in my
impressed. I'm impressed.
um
Stem cell research.
yes, and gene
Heck.
therapy.
Right. Okay. Right. Yeah. Good. Yep.
So, in my search to be as prepared as possible for entry into a PhD program right out of university, I applied to something called the McNair program. I was accepted, and then I applied for the SRIP. So, the SRIP stands for Summer Research Internship Program. It is hosted by the university, where a handful of students, maybe 10 or 11, are selected to participate in a research topic of their choice. And since the COVID-19 pandemic was becoming more and more prominent in our daily lives, when the time came to select a topic, I decided to look further into the pandemic. So while I was researching, I ran across your videos, and because you did start so close to the time when COVID-19 was just beginning to become integrated into the daily news shows and press briefings, I thought it would be a good place to start to build a timeline as how things came to be right now.
Mm.
So basically, over a 6-week period, I viewed your lectures on the novel coronavirus in tandem with other journals, studies, and news reports. So
Yeah.
the purpose of this analysis and the commentary of the documentary work that you were doing during COVID-19 pandemic was basically to, as you said, to obtain a timeline of the major world events and the treatments, including vaccine updates and different therapeutics during the 5-month period from when the coronavirus was first mentioned in daily news to the present situation. And with the information gathered, basically extrapolate based on the evidence that was gathered, how the COVID-19 pandemic would affect the way that society functions on a day-to-day basis. So we are now towards the end of the program, and I thought it would be important to ask some pertinent questions about the videos you posted, as well as your take on the situation in general.
Yep.
So we emailed, and you graciously gave your time to sit for this interview, and for that I must thank you.
No problem.
Um,
I hope the
as
questions
I
aren't too hard though.
no. Um, as I was looking my way through your January videos, I saw an emerging pattern of heightened awareness from you at a time that many would suggest that the majority of the general public had not yet understood or comprehended the gravity of the
Yeah.
situation.
Yeah.
So, what, in your perspective, drove you to think that this new emerging topic
Mm.
would be of interest to your viewers, as
Mm.
well as at what point did you begin to see the cause for alarm, your initial
Yeah.
reaction to news, both
Yeah.
from a clinical and a personal point of
Mm.
view?
Mm. Yeah, well, I think like most of us, I started to hear about this early January and started to put a few things together in my head about it. And just by way of background, I've been making videos for quite a long time now. So I've been making videos since the 90s, educational videos, because for 27 years I was a nurse lecturer. I taught student nurses. And actually one of the things I taught student nurses was about the 1918-1919 pandemic, which as you know, killed between 50 and 100 million people. No one's really quite sure. So I always knew there was going to be another viral pandemic coming. We just didn't know what form it would take and when it would be, but it was inevitable that there would be another pandemic. That wasn't me working that out. That was just the consensus of virological opinion. The virologists were saying this. And then this virus came along and it kind of met quite a few criteria. So it was a zoonotic spillover infection. So that means it came from animals and it was a novel virus. So our immune systems, in fact, all of the human immune systems on the planet had no previous exposure to this virus. Now, there had been similar viruses that were different, like the SARS of 2002, 2003, and the Middle East respiratory syndrome. And indeed, there's 4 coronaviruses that cause the common cold, but they've got different characteristics. So I realised that this was a novel virus and people were calling it a novel coronavirus at that time. And that means our immune systems are naive to it, that we can readily catch it, that there's nothing to stop the virus infecting a person. The big question then was, is there going to be person-to-person transmission? And it transpired in January that that was pretty obviously the case. So we had the probability of a viral pandemic coming at some point. We had a novel zoonotic virus that the human immune system had no previous exposure to, therefore would be susceptible to. And we had the fact that it's a person-to-person transmission had become established. So I realised all these things were an issue. And so biologically, it kind of made sense that this was potentially going to spread. And the other thing that was really concerning was that it seemed that people that were healthy at the time were spreading this virus. Now, at that time, we didn't have the details about the pre-symptomatic and the asymptomatic spread. But it seemed to be different from, for example, the SARS coronavirus type 1 from 2002, 2003, where people were most infectious when they were most ill. Here it seemed that relatively healthy people were spreading the virus. So that was another thing. And then the thing that really convinced me, though, was that the reaction of the Chinese authorities. You know, when I think it was about the Chinese New Year time, around about the 25th of January, when they started closing off a whole city, I thought, just a minute, they're taking this pretty seriously. And the other thing that concerned me was the response of the World Health Organization. At that time, the World Health Organization was saying you don't need to restrict unnecessary travel. There were no travel bans in force. And in fact, I just checked on this, as late as the 29th of February, the World Health Organization was still not imposing travel bans or suggesting travel bans. And we're actually saying that it was wrong to close down unnecessary travel. So given that this virus is not going to swim places, it's going to go on aeroplanes, we had all these routes where the virus would spread. We had a transmissible virus. We had aeroplanes flying back and forth to conveniently spread it around. And I realised then that there was the potential for a pandemic.
And it's interesting that you said that, because I believe that on January 26th, you did say that there would be a potential to become a pandemic. The World Health Organization made a statement almost 3 months later on March 11th that the epidemic that had been so widespread in China and other parts of Asia had become a pandemic. So would you say that your work as a healthcare professional led you to that conclusion early on in the midst of the news coverage story, or was it also the overall experience that you had working in the healthcare profession?
Yeah. Well, I'll give you a bit of background about me, but basically I did various types of nurse training. And then I worked overseas in some poorer parts of the world for a while. And then I did some more academic work. And then after I'd been a nurse for about 10 years, I did a teacher training course to become a nurse lecturer. And I went into full-time nurse lecturing. So that was my main job. I did that for 27 years. But I also did quite a bit of clinical work along the way, and did some work overseas as I went along. So I was always somewhat involved in clinical work as well. But I did become more and more academic and did more and more research. And a big part of that was analysing the validity of research and analysing the validity of data. Now, it has to be stressed that I taught student nurses. I used to teach physiology, pathophysiology, and disease processes mostly. And it also expanded into teaching some other healthcare professionals as well as time went on. So the thing to stress is I'm not a specialist in infectious diseases or anything like that, but I just looked at these factors, and what I didn't understand was why everyone didn't see this. It just seemed so obvious. So we had these experts in the World Health Organization who were basically, in my mind, refusing to escalate this problem that needed to be escalated, when it was fairly self-evident to me just from analysing data in the public domain that this problem was developing. Is that what you asked, Antoinette? Tell me again.
Yes, it is. I said that if your knowledge of clinical studies over the years gave you more insight into the situation that might the general public.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I think basically I just had to take an interest in healthcare, and particularly the way that people live affects their health, and infectious diseases generally. So it just seemed an obvious thing to kind of put together, and because I was a teacher for so long, it's my natural sort of tendency to talk about things when I understand them. So I guess those things kind of came together. Yeah.
You say at one point in your video on March 7th that you are as weak as your weakest link. So
yeah.
What did you mean by this, and in what ways is this idea and this attitude must be applied to the individual as they approach the current situation and the challenges we are faced with?
Yeah, I mean, well, what you have is chains of transmission and transmission drivers. So for example, at the moment, there's a debate about should we open pubs or should we open schools. Which will drive transmission most, in which venue will most new infections take place. So if you had everyone in a society who was behaving themselves really well, but you had a group of people who were going to coronavirus parties to deliberately try and get infected, or were going to parties to have a good time and deliberately ignoring social distancing, then that is going to cause infections, and those infections are going to spread out into the community. So that would be the weak link. So basically an approach to control an infectious disease does depend on the weakest link in that chain. And if there's a weak link, if there's people that are spreading infection, then the infection can go on spreading onto other people. So you kind of have this idea of the weakest link is one that you always need to be looking for. What is the weakest link? How can we strengthen the weakest link? And in the early stages, there seemed to be many weak links. So right at the start of the pandemic, of course, there was the problem with information. It simply wasn't coming out. In fact, information was suppressed. And then later on, when information started coming out, the weakest link there was the air travel that was going on, the lack of social distancing that was going on. All of these things meant that the infection was going to spread, and indeed did spread. In the early days, another weak link was cruise ships, where a lot of people are together in a cruise ship, and there was quite a few outbreaks of COVID-19 in cruise ships. And then, of course, they have the potential to affect other people. So I think that's probably what I meant by weak links.
It's interesting that you are talking about communication and later on how that was distributed throughout the general public. Martin Luther King Jr. once wrote in his letter from Birmingham jail, a shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute understanding from people of ill will. So what I'd like to ask first is, was there a lack of clear, concise communication between news reporters and scientists and the general public? And if so, do you think that such a communication gap is partially responsible for the confusion which transpired throughout the first few critical weeks and months in making sure that accurate information was available to the public? And not only that, but also understanding what the implications of that would have been later on, 2 or 3 months down the road.
I think there was communication problems right at the start between the local authorities in China and the central government in China. So the local authorities didn't want there to be a pandemic because they thought that would get them into trouble with the national authorities. And that just wasn't communicated between the two. But then as time went on, I think the lack of communication and the lack of understanding about the transmissible nature of disease, what was a major factor in the way it spread. And in the early days, people didn't know about simple things like hand hygiene. I remember back in, I can't remember when it was, but we actually made a video on how to wash your hands properly. Things like that weren't known about. And the thing that really confuses me about this pandemic is things like mask wearing. So, for example, in China, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, Thailand, all these countries, mask wearing was implemented, and there was no question that mask wearing, it was just axiomatic that people would wear masks. And yet in Western countries, people didn't seem to wear masks. So I thought if the Chinese are wearing masks, then they probably know something that we don't necessarily know. Therefore, it's a good idea to wear masks. But that message really hasn't become clear for a long, long time. So there was definitely gaps in communication. And one of the other things that was surprising about this is that the people that specialise in this, like the World Health Organization, like the epidemiologists, like the doctors who specialise in infectious diseases, they didn't seem to be giving clear messages at all. And even although they were talking to governments, the governments weren't giving out clear messages, and very often those messages were changing. So some messaging was clear, but a lot of it was quite ambiguous, and it changed over time. And I really don't understand why specialists in infectious diseases were debating about wearing masks when the Chinese and the Taiwanese seem to have known it for a long, long time. But we know that communication is a problem. I mean, I did a video a couple of days ago on Bolivia, where there's horrendous problems now. People are literally dying in the streets in Bolivia. And part of the problem there is that there are 30 different languages in Bolivia. So communication is difficult. Or another example would be the Somali community in Sweden, who often don't speak very good Swedish and weren't really tuned into the Swedish health information that was coming out. So communication is essential, because it's only when people are on board and obeying the requirements that you're going to suppress the pandemic, because it's now clear that what you need is at least 80% of people suppressing the transmission of the disease by mask wearing, by social distancing, by hand hygiene, to get this vital R figure below 1, so that the number of cases goes on reducing. So I think there's definitely a lesson to learn there about how we communicate scientific knowledge to members of the public. Absolutely.
What, in your opinion, was one advantage and one disadvantage of the way that the situation of the initial outbreak was handled by different countries around the world? So, like, for example, you mentioned that some countries have a tendency to wear a mask more often than others. Do you feel that that is perhaps because of previous outbreaks in that general area?
Places like Taiwan and South Korea suffered quite badly from the SARS-1, so they were ready. Taiwan had a whole plan ready that was just triggered at the appropriate time to stop the spread of the transmission. So the good point is that some countries acted early, because the earlier you act in the outbreak of a disease, the easier it is and the less expensive it is. So because Taiwan acted early, they had a fairly dramatic interventions, fairly dramatic contact tracing, but they introduced that early, and the later you introduce it, the more problematic it becomes. So in the United States at the moment, effective contact tracing is effectively impossible, just because of the sheer numbers of cases. So really the good point is that some people acted early, and the bad thing is that a lot of people acted late, and I think the reason for that was they just could not conceptualize the concept of a pandemic. Because they'd no experience of it in their generation, or even in their parents' generation, they kind of imagined it couldn't happen. And yet it did happen. So good points, early preparedness. Bad points, complacency that a pandemic could not happen, therefore we don't need to bother preparing for it.
Right now, their World Health Organization has announced that there are more than 23 vaccines that are currently in development.
Yeah.
One of those vaccines is a Chinese biotech company, CanSino. They've used weakened cold virus that inserts the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine, and it's in phase 2 and appears to be producing neutralizing antibody responses. So another company, Moderna, the Massachusetts biotech firm, is developing 2 vaccines, and they're using mRNA to provoke an immune response. The Lancet, the journal, published results of some vaccines that have been under development, like the vaccine between Oxford and AstraZeneca. So the AZD1221 vaccine. And they had 1,000 patients. They're saying that maybe it may take 2 doses to produce antibodies and responses in T cells. Andrew Pollard of the University of Oxford, which is the study's lead author, said the vaccine is intended to induce 2 types of responses, the T cells and also the antibody response. And they said, we hope this means the immune system will remember the virus so that our vaccine will protect people for the extended period. So my question is, what do you feel going forward these vaccines are going to be produced mostly? For example, what would be the advantage and the disadvantage? Moderna, for example, is frozen, while the AstraZeneca vaccine simply needs to be kept cold. What are the logistical communications and information that need to be known about this vaccine now for when it's time to be vaccinated, there is sufficient amounts?
So there's quite a few. There's about 100 vaccine programs going on around the world, and quite a few are at different stages. As you say, that there's probably 20 odd programs that are at a reasonable stage of development, probably phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trials. I think there's only about 4 vaccines at the stage 3 clinical trial stage at the moment. There's the Moderna one, there's, as you say, the Oxford AstraZeneca one, and a couple of more that are at a more advanced stage. Now, basically, I'm fairly optimistic about there being an effective vaccine. And the reason for that, the reason I'm optimistic, is that this virus seems to mutate really quite slowly. So it's likely that one vaccine will be good against all the coronavirus forms or the COVID-19 SARS coronavirus 2 viruses in the world, because they're not changing that much. As you rightly say, traditionally vaccines are an attenuated organism. They're either a dead organism, an attenuated, which means weakened organism, or fragments of the organism that the body would represent as antigenic. But there's these new, as you say, messenger RNA virus vaccines that are being developed now. And they, so far, both forms do seem to be producing antibodies. Now, what we would need is the virus to produce antibodies. And we know that that does seem to be happening with these 4 vaccines that are in phase 3 clinical trials. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been much point going on to phase 3 clinical trials where we're trying on 30 or 40,000 people in the real world situation to see if that actually gives immunity. Because it's one thing producing antibodies in the lab, and it's another thing actually being immune in the real world. The two don't necessarily overlap. They're not always the case. And of course, we have to make sure that vaccines are not only efficacious, but you have to make sure they're safe, because vaccines have the potential to do harm as well as the potential to do good. And we're only going to know that with large-scale trials. So we know these antibodies are these vaccines are producing antibodies. But the antibodies only last for 2 or 3 months in COVID-19. The antibodies are very short-lived. So if you had the disease in February, for example, you won't be able to take the antibodies now, because after 3 months they're basically undetectable. Now, that doesn't mean that we won't be immune, because the antibodies were actually made by cells called B lymphocytes. And the B lymphocytes differentiate into cells called plasma cells that produce untold billions of these antibodies. But the B lymphocytes will only go into action when they're stimulated by T helper cells that stimulate the B cells to produce the antibodies. And you might have heard of T helper cells, because that's the cell that's affected by the human immunodeficiency virus that attacks the T helper cells. So the T helper cells are no longer able to stimulate the B cells to produce the antibodies. But the clever thing is that once the immune system has generated the antibodies and eradicated the infection, there's a population of several thousand of these T cells that are described as memory cells. And they will remember specifically how to give the instructions to the B cells to make that particular form of antibody. So that means if someone is reinfected with the virus, the immune system is already primed. These T cells will go into action, and there'll be a clonal expansion straight away, greatly increasing the numbers of those specific T cells that will stimulate untold numbers of B cells to make the antibodies again. So these vaccines, the ones that are in phase 3 trials, do seem to be generating a T cell response. So that is hopeful. So again, theoretically it's hopeful, or in terms of bench work it's hopeful. But of course we don't know how that's going to transpire into the real world. We know they're efficacious in vitro. We do not yet know they are completely efficacious in vivo, in the real life situation. But I am quite optimistic. And the other point you made there is when you have a vaccine, vaccines are often very complicated structures. That they have proteins and things in them. And proteins, of course, if you warm them up, will denature. Just like when you cook an egg, the yolk goes from clear to being white as the protein denatures. So most vaccines I've used in the past, it's been necessary to have a guaranteed cold or cool chain. And this has been a major problem. I once conducted a vaccination program in a refugee camp in the middle of nowhere. And to guarantee that the vaccines arrived cool was actually quite a big logistical exercise. So they had to be brought in from the United States or Europe, wherever they were made, flown in cool conditions, stored in cool conditions, and then we had to pick them up in cool boxes and only take them out of the cool box immediately before we were going to administer them. So cold chain logistics is always a problem, but it's a problem that we are very used to dealing with. It's a well recognised problem. So I would be very optimistic that that wouldn't be an issue in allowing us to give COVID-19 vaccine to large numbers of people. And of course, we probably will need about 14 billion doses of this vaccine. Because as you say, it looks like one dose of the vaccine is not going to be sufficient. We're going to need 2 doses, and that's going to be pretty well for everyone in the planet that's going to require that. So there's a big job ahead. I think by the end of, I think the Moderna vaccine, for example, they're hoping to produce enough vaccine to vaccinate everyone in the United States by January 2021, maybe February. And they hope to produce 1 billion doses of the vaccine by the end of 2021. But of course, 1 billion doses isn't enough. We need a lot of the vaccine. And I just hope that these companies make this vaccine available at cost price to save many, many poor populations around the world.
It's interesting that you mentioned the idea that some of these vaccines are being accelerated in the trials. One such country that recently announced, Russia, that the vaccine rollout has been through the safety trials, but not necessarily through complete phase 3, which, as you know, is meant to see if the vaccine really works in the real world with tens of thousands of individuals. What is your opinion on this decision? Is it safe to do so, or do you believe that more testing is needed in order to really know the side effects, or is it just necessary to push forward because COVID-19 is so rampant in different areas?
Yeah, there's an old saying in healthcare, first said by Hippocrates in ancient Greece, which is first do no harm. So if you come to me as my patient and I treat you, and I don't make you better, then that's one thing. But if you come to me as my patient and I make you worse, that's not acceptable. This is called iatrogenesis, and it does happen. It is a common problem. Many treatments cause harm. So we need to make sure this vaccine is safe. I've come across people that have been infected with HIV from healthcare, allegedly so-called healthcare professionals reusing their needles. And I've come across that in Asia, and I've come across that in Eastern Europe. It's an awful thing. Now, the standard procedure for any drug or any vaccine, whatever it is you have these phases of clinical trials. So the phase 1 is well, first of all, you do animal studies, toxicology studies. Then phase 1 will be on a small number of healthy volunteers. Phase 2 typically on a large number of volunteers. And phase 3 it should be a randomized, double-blind, ideally controlled trial in the real-world situation. So you would recruit 30,000 people into the study, for example. 15,000 would have the vaccine, 15,000 would have the placebo. Entry to each of these groups has to be randomized. It must be random allocation. And then you can compare the efficacy in both groups. You can compare the side effect profile in both groups. You can compare the toxicology or whatever it is in both groups. You've got this 2-group comparison. Now, that is the standard way to do it. And that is the way we're going with the COVID-19 vaccine. So what we're doing with the COVID-19 vaccine is actually exactly the same as we would do with any other new drug. And that is the way we do it. Now, when a drug goes out of phase 3 or a vaccine goes out of phase 3 clinical trials and it goes into real world use, it's not then that data stops being gathered. The manufacturers will carry on collecting data. This is sometimes called a phase 4 trial. It's actually the real world data. They'll carry on collecting data. And there's been quite a few examples of drugs that were realized to be dangerous only when there was tens of thousands or maybe millions of users. And then sometimes drugs have been modified or their recommendations have been changed, or occasionally drugs have been withdrawn because they're realized to be dangerous at a larger scale. So after phase 3 studies, once they're completed, we will still be monitoring the efficacy of the vaccine and still monitoring the side effects and the risks of the vaccine. It won't just stop all of a sudden. But for it to be used in the real world situation, it must complete these phase 3 clinical trials. And personally, I feel satisfied that most phase 3 clinical trials are done correctly and safely in the world. So I don't see any reason why this vaccine should be any different to any new drug or vaccine.
So, from your expertise and your time in the healthcare professional career, what, in your opinion, is one thing that we should learn or that we must learn from this pandemic, both socially and personally on a larger scale?
Yeah, sure. I think probably the main thing to learn is that throughout human history, most people have died of infectious disease. Now, because we had antibiotics, we kind of got used to the idea that infectious diseases could be treated. But of course, most viral diseases can't be treated. And we've still got problems with antibiotic resistance, of course. We still need new antibiotics. So this idea that humans are at risk of transmissible disease, that we live in a milieu of viruses, there's untold numbers of viruses and bacteria out there. I don't think anyone really knows even how many types of virus there are. Many. One figure I heard was something like 10 to the 23 types of viruses. It's just unimaginable numbers of viruses. And we have to realize that there is always the potential for these to cause infection. So I think if we learn that pandemics are possible and that future pandemics could occur, and that, like Taiwan, if we learn from this pandemic and have all these systems in place ready just to click into action if there's another pandemic, exactly the same way Taiwan did after the SARS 2002, 2003, that would be a good lesson to learn from this pandemic. Because one thing that I think a lot of people don't realise, Antoinette, and I think it's a really important point, is we've actually been quite lucky with this virus. We could have had a virus which was as transmissible as measles and as deadly as Ebola, for example. That's not impossible. So we've actually been relatively fortunate that this virus has the limited transmissibility that it has and the limited pathogenicity and virulence that it has. It could have been much more transmissible and much more deadly. So this virus, a future pandemic, it's no exaggeration to say it has the potential to kill half of the people on the planet. That is possible, and it's happened before with bacterial infections in the Black Death, for example, that arrived in the UK in England as it was in those days in 1348. This has happened before, and the risk is it could happen again. And the other thing we really need to do, of course, is work on antivirals. I mean, if we had a treatment to eradicate this virus, then it really wouldn't be a problem. But we do not have very many effective antiviral drugs. So we need to have these programs ready to kick into place for a future pandemic, which could be so much more deadly. And we need to really work hard on antiviral medications. I think there may be the two things we need to learn. Socially, I think people are quite well trained up now. There's quite a lot of emerging evidence that people's behaviour now is quite dramatically different to what it was in January in terms of social distancing, hygiene, mask wearing, all these things. People are much better educated now, so that's good. And I think it's a matter of keeping that up as well, because, you know, if years go past and there's no more infections, then people will start forgetting again. Just as the generation after 1918 died out and the next generation became perhaps somewhat complacent again. I think we have to make sure that we don't become complacent again.
So very much a matter of not forgetting history as it happened.
So much you can learn from the history of disease. Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Campbell, for your insight. It would be incredibly helpful to be able to write the conclusion of my paper. I will, of course, send that to you.
That would be great. Thank you, Antoinette. Yeah. Yeah. Is that us? That wasn't too hard. I thought you were going to ask some hard ones. I was a bit nervous. You're a very kind interviewer. That's great. Yes, send me a link. We'd love to see that. Yeah. And now, will this be available? Because it's not just you and me here. There's a few thousand other people watching this. So, will your work be available to the interested viewer to watch as well?
I think it would be. What we're doing is, so McNair basically has for the school that you can go ahead and turn it in. It's basically like a research fair. So what we do is when everything is over, we submit it to the university, and then the university kind of is like the peer reviewer of it, and
Okay.
then they release it.
Okay. Well, yeah. So that'll be in a few months' time, presumably.
Yeah, sometime September, late
Yeah.
November.
No, if you send me the link and anyone's interested, and then hopefully we can all have a good look at that. That'll be interesting.
Yeah.
Good. Oh, right. Okay. Thanks, Antoinette. Nice to talk to you. Thanks for asking interesting questions.
Thank you, Dr. Campbell. I really
Okay.
appreciate it.
No problem. Right.